Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Those of you here in the room, I want to extend my warmest welcome to you. I heard it's like 17 degrees this morning when I got up. And those of you joining us virtually, welcome to you as well. This is the Exploring the Faith at First Presbyterian Church here in Ann Arbor, Michigan on January 19th, 2025. And we're just delighted that you are with us no matter how you're joining us. I also do want to just a quick reminder that because we are live streamed and also recording this, when we get to our question and answer period or comments at the end, we'll be passing around the microphone. It seems like the transmission of our voices is much better for the recording and live stream if we do that. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. But at this time, I am really excited to get us started with our presentation, Wrestling with Big Decisions, Speaking of Heaven, where we will briefly explore the ways in which different civilizations and faith have imagined the afterlife. And I am thrilled that Dr. Sydney Smith is, as of this morning, an elder in our church who was just ordained. Those of you, yes, agreed. And in addition to that, she is also the Lorna G. Goodison Distinguished University Professor Emerita of English and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. She has authored and co-authored 20 books in her field of life writing and feminist theory. She received her bachelor and master's degree from the University of Michigan and her PhD from Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Smith is currently at work on a novel based on the lives of her maternal grandmother and grandfather. Isn't that just the best? So if you would please join me in welcoming Professor Emerita and our new elder, Dr. Sid Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you. Bill, I need to figure out, I found it. Okay, I found it. I've needed the down thing. Welcome this morning and welcome to anybody joining online. I was worried that people weren't interested in heaven, but now you've been trickling in. So I thought, oh no. I just will say a word at the beginning. In my faith statement for becoming an elder, which you have to write, I talked mostly about my unbelief and how I got to be an unbelieving person. And through some literary texts when I was an undergraduate, and also an experience that hung with me that I had with my older sister. She was 14 years older than me. And when our father died, I was a freshman here at Michigan. And I had a conversation with her not long after that, although with memory, I don't know whether it was a couple of years or a couple of months. But she was newly, energetically fundamentalist. And I had a conversation in which I said, you know, Dad didn't go to church. Do you think he went to heaven? And she said, oh, no. He can't go to heaven. He's not born again. And that was my, it's always been in the back of my head. I've always wanted to tell her about what she did to me when I was young. It was so cruel, righteously cruel. So it was cruelty in righteousness. And so it kind of affected how I've ever thought about heaven. So it's good to be thinking about it and pondering what we ourselves think about it historically, what some other civilizations have thought about it. I'd like you just for about 2 minutes to just jot down, I've got paper and pens up here, what do you think of when you hear the word heaven, or what is your concept of heaven? Just some features of it. Here, Bill, you have to do it too. This is my Kleenex. Oh, and I have pens. Does anybody need, do we have any need for pens? It's now 2 minutes is now up. Okay. All right. Anybody? These are the people that come with pens. These are the prepared people. Okay, here you go. Yes. Everybody's going to be, it's going to be put through AI to see if you've plagiarized the concept of heaven. God, I'm dropping these everywhere. Has it been 3 minutes?
No, she asked me what says up there because she doesn't have a glass.
Starting with first things. Okay. I'm going to go on now. You know, if we think about why do people have concepts of something that happens after death? Most civilizations do have something about that. So I just put a whole set of questions here, and at the end, Catherine has composed another list of questions so people can take it with them, and has copies for people, but it's all the kinds of things. Hers is more about what do you think about heaven and the aspects of being there. Mine are, why do human beings make this design a concept, and all the different kinds of sub-questions that come into play. I'm not going to go through these. We can return to them if you want. I want to take a look at some other comparative civilizations in the Mediterranean, actually, and then I'll do something on indigenous and Buddhist. But if you remember, we had a conversation last year when we were talking about gods. Speaking of God, about the Egyptians. The Egyptians had a very elaborate plan, a very elaborate concept of the afterlife. And it was related to, it was a complex realm. They had, only certain people could go there, mostly the pharaohs. They had a possibility of going to some kind of long afterlife, and very wealthy officials in the Egyptian bureaucracy, both in the church and the empire. So it was a limited space, it was an exclusive space, but it was there were a lot of rules about what it was going to be like and what would happen. Where you went and whether you got there depended on the quality of the life you lived. You needed good deeds and a good soul, and it would be an eternal afterlife. There was a complicated journey to get there, and the Egyptian Book of the Dead lays out all aspects of that journey, what the person must do along the way. There are gates to get through. There's modes of transportation. The boat was one of them, of course, because that's how they traveled along the river. And there was a point at which there would be the judgment of, and I'm going to go to the next slide, the judgment of Ma'at. And this is a passage from the Book of the Dead, in which the soul is being, the soul of the pharaoh or the soul of the person that's been mummified, is put on a scale against Ma'at's feather, a feather from Ma'at, the goddess Ma'at. And that was how it would be determined. If the soul was as light as the feather of Ma'at, then you would be able to go on to this glorious afterlife. If it wasn't, you didn't go any further. Now, of course, there was I think the pharaohs had a pretty good chance of everybody thinking, who was all the artists who were making all the hieroglyphics for the tombs of the pharaohs and all the priests who were officiating, had a pretty good sense that most pharaohs would be getting on. But there was that important judgment. And of course, the body had to be prepared in a particular way. And mummification, that's mostly how we as children are introduced to Egyptian civilization, through mummification. It's a very complicated, was a complicated process, 70 days. The brain was immediately removed because they were worried that it would contaminate the body. The organs, 4 organs in the gut, were taken out, and they were placed in jars that were set around the tomb. The heart was removed and then put back in. The body was wrapped in linen and secured with resin. There was a ritual striking of parts of the body, mostly places where the senses were, to kind of awaken the deceased and get it ready for moving through the process of getting to the afterlife. And there was always in the tombs with the bodies and the catafalque that the body was in, there could be the pharaoh's dogs mummified, there was food, there were utensils, anything from this life that you wanted to take with you in the next life was in the tomb. Okay? And that was objects. It was objects and oftentimes animals. And this gives you a sense of one of the possible hieroglyphics that has something to do with this beautiful place that you get to, which is flowing, has water, has lush growth. Everybody's happy. Okay, the Greeks and the afterlife. You know from your study of ancient Greek civilization, maybe a long time ago, that the gods and goddesses controlled human life in unpredictable ways, and they played with the fate of humans. Come on in, there's space up here, or over to the side if you're not a front sitter. When the person died, they were interred in an elaborate burial process. They believed that at the moment of death, the essence of the human left the body and went to the afterworld. The afterworld, or the underworld, was ruled by one of the gods, who was Zeus's brother, Hades, and another goddess, Persephone, the goddess of the fertility and the return of spring and growth and life again. And then, but the underworld, if you traveled there, and I'll show you in a minute passages from the Odyssey about the travel in the underworld. The underworld was filled in the time, before, like up until about 300 BC, the underworld was inhabited by what were called shades. In translation into English was shades. These kind of ghost-like presences. And they were just there. They were captured there. They were caught there, I suppose, caught there for a kind of eternity. And here's some passages from the Odyssey. And this is a Grecian urn with a picture of Hades and Persephone, or a portrait of Hades and Persephone on it. Odysseus on his return home, as you know, if you know the Odyssey, I've read it, there's a lot of trials. It took him Odysseus 10 years to get back from the Trojan War to his wife and son again. And he had all these places he was held captive in, and then he had to do certain kinds of things before he could move to the next part of his journey. And one of them is to go to the underworld. And he goes down to the underworld. And the second of these, the longer one, is a passage at the beginning when he gets to the underworld. Then there gathered from out of Erebus the spirits of those that are dead, brides and unwedded youths, and toil-worn old men and tender maidens with hearts yet new to sorrow, and many too that had been wounded with bronze-tipped spears, men slain in fight, wearing their blood-stained armor. These came thronging in crowds about the pit from every side with a wondrous cry, and pale fear seized me. Then I called to my comrades and bade them, and then he does a sacrifice to keep him safe from the shades. But the upper passage is interesting. He comes upon the warrior Achilles in the underworld. It wasn't the only one he came into contact with. But Achilles says to him, Odysseus, you must not comfort me for death. I would prefer to be a workman hired by a poor man on a peasant farm than rule as king of all the dead. A sense of this was not a place that was desirable to be in. And Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes during the Trojan War, even he would return as a lowly servant, a lowly peasant. The Romans the Romans had their own ideas about death, similar to the Greeks in some ways, and the Aeneas, or the Aeneid, the book about the return of Aeneas, who was a Trojan, the escape from Troy of Aeneas, is in Virgil's Aeneid, and there's a passage where he goes down to the underworld. The visual here is it's a Rembrandt portrayal of Aeneid entering the underworld. The underworld in the Aeneid, too, is full of shades waiting and lingering. And so, in a sense, it could have been like a purgatory, which hadn't quite yet been developed in the early Christian church. Aeneas's guide, Sibyl, tells him of two paths. Those of wicked deeds proceed to Tartarus, named after the figure of Tartar, who suffered endless punishment for defying the gods. And so they go, Tartarus is where there are torturous punishments, and those who lived lives of good deeds proceeded to Elysium to sing and dance and have a pleasant life. And then, I'm not going to read this now, but this is about that Aeneas getting with the guide Sibyl to that turning point, or that diversion, the divergent roads that you could move through in the underworld. we talked a little bit last year when we were talking about God too, about Hinduism and what they believed. And you know that they have the highest, the most important, the creator God is Brahma. And there's a lot of other gods who are aspects of Brahma, both male and female, and they are the ones that are, it's not that Brahma isn't represented. He will be on the next slide, but there are common gods like Vishnu and Ganesha. Those are the gods here. So what Hinduism brought to this, it's always an interesting thing, is the notion of reincarnation and an endless cycle of reincarnation. Brahma is at the center of the universe. At death, Atman, the soul, that was a term, Atman, for the soul or the breath of life or the divine and the human. The Atman is set loose and will return as another being. It can be a human being or an animal being. It returns, and how you returned was dependent on how you lived your life during that lifetime that you have just left. And this process, the cycle of death and rebirth, was called samsara, in which the Atman is born again and again in an embodiment that derives from their karma, their particular karma, their mode of being, their set of intentional actions that have consequences. So on the left, this is one of the symbols that's used for the notion of samsara. The idea was you were trying to get to, you were hoping that you would get to unification with Brahma, and at which the process of reincarnation would stop because you had shed more and more of your desires and saw more and more of this perfection of Brahma. And so what you hoped for is to move through. You can see the soul coming out. It's on the left side. It's rather tethered to some, probably based on bad deeds or faithlessness or the giving into one's desires. The person, this is symbolized a person coming back as some kind of being, and then eventually hoping to get into the cycle to the left, which would be cleansing oneself to a greater and greater degree until you have reached the oneness with Brahma. I won't say too much about Islam. In fact, I'll skip over this just because of time. But again, there is the belief in paradise and hell, and that it has to do with the qualities of the righteousness of the person and accountability for actions that people did. This is an interesting one, and Catherine sent me in this direction with indigenous people in the Northern Hemisphere. On the second one, in the second blue box, it's interesting to me that some indigenous cultures, such as the Sami in northern Finland and Norway and Sweden, attribute, because their life is so connected to the appearance of the aurora borealis, these cultures, the aurora borealis was a medium of spirit ancestors. It was kind of where the human could glimpse the return of ancestors through the lights and how they played. And the Sami added hearing because they had a way of hearing the sound of the northern lights. And so they added that dimension of being able to hear the ancestors communicating across the worlds of the dead and the world of the living. And so this is a piece generated by Spirit of the Northern Sky by a contemporary artist. Now, if we get to early Christianity, the early challenge in the Christian communities had to do with how soon the end would come, how soon Christ would reign on earth. But of course, decades went by, and early Christians were dying. So what in the world was happening to them? What do you do if you now realize that immanence is not going to be a part of what this moment of kind of making the transition to life to death? What do you do about the people you love? What's going to happen to them? So I was poking around and reading various things on the early Gospels, and one of them I came upon was an interesting take on what the early Christians came up on. So the Gospel of Luke seems to make the shift from an imminent kingdom to a future kingdom, okay, which are two different things. And one hypothesis is that Luke focused on converting pagans. We know that about Luke. And to convert pagans, you had to compete with a lot of the narratives of the afterlife from the pagan civilizations around the Mediterranean. And they all, they had a basket of possibilities to offer. But there were religions of salvation, which included the Persian cults. There were later Greek cults of a lush Hades. The Egyptians with their resurrection and their the judgment of Osiris. Osiris is the one who's judging how that scale, how the soul, whether the soul is light enough to go on to the underworld. And there were also this notion of the Trinity in Egyptian religions of three powerful gods and goddesses, which is, I think it was one of the M's. I think it was Mark that traveled to Egypt or Matthew traveled to Egypt. Anyway, so one of the apostles is said to have spent time in Egypt. So perhaps this notion of some kind of future movement through an underworld for Luke, who is trying to think about how you would convert pagans around the Mediterranean. He may have been adjusting in his gospel how to think about what happened after death. We know that, I showed you this a couple weeks ago when we were talking about lightness and darkness and the importance of darkness. This is the artists had great times depicting in kind of post-800 AD and through the early modern period, visions of hell. You can imagine that they're much more interesting to look like than visions of happy people. That doesn't kind of draw us. So this is this wonderful one. I've blown up, or I found a blow up of the mouth and this is about Christ's descent into hell. This is visual. You know, we say that in the Creed, he descended into hell. I never started to think about, well, what was he doing there? Except I knew he was there for purportedly for 3 days. But there are a lot of paintings from the medieval period, early modern period, on the descent into hell. And here's this glorious Day of Judgment by Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel. This gets us to the question about what happened to hell. And hell interests me, the belief in hell interests me more than the belief in heaven. And its purpose. What is the purpose for having a place where you can only imagine the horror of the punishment? And the question about, is it hell that defines heaven or heaven defines hell? What is that interesting relation dynamic between them? And then, are they states of mind, states of belief and unbelief, states of grace, states of ethics and morals? Kind of what are we attaching to these two places, but particularly hell? So there were some, there were quite a few words around the Mediterranean at the time of the early church for this, what you would call this place. So this netherworld, this hell, as I said, the Greek called it Hades, after the god that ruled there. In the Old Testament, the transliteration of the word for this place, Hades, is Sheol. And the Romans called it Infernus, and some other civilizations called it Gehenna. And it wasn't really, although there are glimpses of something called Sheol in the Old Testament, not so much about hell in the New Testament, but the apocryphal, the early apocryphal, many of the apocryphal Gospels and texts of the Old and New Testament, but particularly the New Testament, do have images, especially, and there was Nicodemus, an early church father from the 6th century, talks about Christ going to Hades before his resurrection to gather up all the good people, including John the Baptist, and taking them with him to heaven when he goes off there. So they're kind of around the 500, 600 AD or ACE, this concept of hell becomes really prominent in the church. And so you have these divergent paths in the heaven and hell. And I want to just suggest some things about these. I wanted to think about larger cultural, political, and economic issues, and how threats of going to hell have operated in these arenas. So, interestingly enough, there's this woman, Stanford researcher, Catherine Jin Lum, who wrote this what looks to be a fascinating book about why hell became so important in the early decades of the American Republic, and how it had to do with the experiment with democracy, and that sense of how unwieldy democracy could be if you had a large voting population. You'd have to know that they were responsible and that you'd want them to have good morals and good ethics and want to work together for the betterment of others as well as themselves. And so threats of hell in the American churches became one of the routes through which you could constitute the good new Democrat of the American Republic. And you could begin to project the values you wanted in your citizenship. Okay, so that's an interesting way. And probably there's a lot more that could be done about the political utility of hell in terms of, at least in terms of Christianity. Okay, so that's one. Let's see this is really important. The other thing that happened that Lum looks at is what she was reading a lot of diaries of people moving across the United States to settle in the western part. And in order to settle there, they had to evacuate the heathens. And of course it was through reservations and the herding of them, and through murder, and through starvation. That's why a lot of the buffalo were being killed just to prevent native peoples from getting food, and starving them out of their lands. And Lum finds how it was that the notion that heathens are damned because they are going to go to hell because they don't believe in the Christian principles and in Christ, and especially if they haven't been converted, you can either convert them, which happened when the whole process of taking young children from their reservations and sending them east to Christian schools to be Christianized and civilized. You can either do that, or you can just murder them because they are damned. They are the damned. So they don't have the soul. And this is a reference to what she found. In examining diaries of people traveling in the overland trail from the east to the west, for example, she found personal accounts detailing the opening of Native American graves and observers' opinions that their skulls were those of people who had no souls. So if you have no soul, you're expendable. You're an animal. I mean, you've gone down the great chain of being. You're less than human. I mean, and it was enshrined in the Constitution that slaves were 3/5 of a human being. They weren't human. So that justified all that was done to them. So then there's threats of punishment are important to transmit, or these divergent paths. You can go this way, you can go that way. They're important for kind of inculcating an ethical system about what the good life is and what the bad life is, and so beliefs about heaven and particularly about hell reveal a lot about how people think they should be living. I mean, it's a tool for people to internalize a certain kind of ethical system and ethical obligations. It's also been really important, especially hell, to the rise of capitalism. There was I came upon in a Harvard magazine this really interesting report on some research from 2004. Researchers who were doing surveys and trying to figure out whether if you had a strong belief in hell, it would be good for the economy or bad for the economy. And I mean, there are reasons to think about this, because Max Weber, the great social theorist, wrote about Protestantism and the rise of capital and capitalism, because and the importance of the Puritan sense of virtues and the rigor of their system of what was right living, and particularly what was wrong living, created habits of mind and habits of the body and habits of thinking that enabled people to develop a system that relied on, for instance, on the good side, for instance, honesty, openness to other people, a sense of your obligation to other people, and so you could become a good, a rising entrepreneurial or a rising business person. So there's been a lot of work on the importance of Christian beliefs of kind of punishments and the pleasures of hell and the punishment, or the pleasures of heaven. Sorry. Some people probably, the sadomasochists may like it down there. I don't know. The other thing that happens is the rhetoric of hell. The rhetoric of hell is really important psychologically, psychoculturally, for securing compliance to certain ethical systems or group norms. Now, interestingly enough, early in the church, threats of punishment promoted support for social norms around helping the poor and the hungry. And we understand where that comes from. But in some things I was reading, people were pointing to the fact that in certain forms of Christianity now, and especially on the far right and in the evangelical community, there's not so much talk about helping the poor and hungry. There's talk about the personalized issues of sinning, so how people live, what their choices are to live. And so the rhetoric of hell, or the possibility of going to hell, and not it's internalized as an individualized agenda related to your set of sins, but also then projecting the norms of what's right behavior onto the behavior of everybody in the community. The other thing about the rhetoric of hell, it leads to agendas of civilizing and converting heathens. And so surveilling other people's spirituality and extinguishing other people's spirituality in order to fit them in order to make them over to be able to be saved and to have access to this afterlife. So there are all kinds of ways where there are ways in which we can think about I think you can imagine being interested in painting this painting or producing this. Anyway, there's a lot more to think about of how is it that you make money off of believing in hell? and the Catholic Church certainly did that through the processes of indulgences. And that was one of the reasons Martin Luther King and other priests became very unhappy with the church, because it corrupted what you could do to make people feel better about going to hell is to extract wealth from them and to extract service, like send them on the crusades and tell them that if they go on the crusades, they will have indulgence. There's two different kinds of indulgence. One is kind of low-grade indulgence, and the other one is big indulgence. Everything you've done will be forgiven, and if you go and fight in this war. And of course, the Crusaders were extracting wealth in the places they overran, oftentimes, and sending it back to the church. So there was wealth generated through the Crusades as well as war. And I think it's interesting to think now about the everyday practices with living heaven and hell. If I were to say, what are everyday practices around us of how people live with the belief in heaven and hell, what would you come up with? Or what interests you about that?
Yeah, so if anyone has a comment or response.
Nancy?
Well, I think that the whole orientation of the church around this has changed remarkably.
Yes.
Because when I was a kid, I went to a hell and damnation church, and it was preached every Sunday, believer go to hell. And I have seen even the more conservative churches moving away from that kind of rhetoric. I mean, I think it's still there in some churches more than others, but certainly you don't hear about hell in this church. I mean, you don't get threatened when you come to church here. But there was a lot of that for many of us growing up in fundamentalist churches.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just add to that now it's fashionable, I would say, to say that God is love and that death in hell is the absence of God's love. And that's like that's currently what we believe. It's either you're in God's love or it's the absence of God's love, not hell and damnation.
Although that, it follows, I mean, you do have to represent what it means to be out of God's love. And then, so the metaphors come in about what that's like. It's a darkness. It's a frightening place. It's so it may be that the word hell is not used, but it could be that it just is returning in its benign form, or, I mean, that's one way to think about it. I'm not, that would be, I would be inclined to think about it that way, but that doesn't mean, I don't know anything about heaven and hell.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Beth, member of the church. I'm just thinking everyday practices of living with heaven and hell today makes me think about how we use TikTok or any of these technologies where we can create a following for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We can create an image, any image you want, and then you can be popular. And it's a sickness. It reminds me of hell. Kind of. Yeah.
Yes.
Here.
I was going to say, I learned early. I was a hockey player, and we always had hockey games on Sunday mornings. And Grandma would say, "Andy, you're going to hell." And she offered me redemption of watching Billy Graham with her. She was a true Southern Baptist.
Yeah. Susan.
So I don't know if people still say this particular prayer, but I think it would be worth putting our minds to what are what are prayers that you say daily or often, or that you have taught your children to say? Because I grew up not going to church, although I certainly from the culture had the sense of heaven and hell. And it was much later that I realized my older sister had taught me to pray. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take.
Yes.
And that is hugely, it's a very scary kind of thing. First of all, for a child to be thinking, well, I might die before I actually wake up tomorrow morning, you know. So I think that probably in ways that are not immediately coming to mind, there's a lot embedded in the words that we carry with us or teach to others that has to do with heaven and hell.
My mother was very insistent that we not say that prayer, that we say instead, thy love stay with me through the night and keep me till the morning light, rather than the other.
Yeah, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, Sid.
Okay. Yeah, we've come
Other-
up on an hour, so.
Yeah, other questions or comments?
I had one more general comment I wanted to make that would be, it's not out of any expertise on my part at all, but except for the piece about the Sami, you know, most
Yes.
of what we're talking about here are class-based societies.
Right.
And I do think that in many indigenous groups that are based more around community and less on class, the idea of the afterlife, which is there, is very different. I also think that many people, and I could be speaking out of turn, from raised in those traditions might add to the list of where does the afterlife come from, in addition to the questions you have. What is your experience?
Right.
What is your experience of connecting with people who are no longer on this plane? So I thought that was really fascinating to think about how we set up our class societies in this life, how, as you're saying, how useful these beliefs are, but it also structures our way of thinking
Exactly.
in very important ways. So that really jumped out at me. I really thank you for the presentation.
You know, imagine what it would be like to, I mean, this is so white and so first world, but imagine what it would have been like for all of those areas that Christians missionized, that believed in the living beings of the ancestors that were always in your day. Imagine how that process would work out, that like being sent to Christian schools, being forced to become Christians, being forced to convert, and being expected then to internalize a whole other system of connection with the dead and the death, the afterworld. I mean,
Yeah, you're asking the big questions for sure. I think we have time just for one more comment.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that you had us at the beginning write our conceptions of heaven, but you didn't ask us about our conceptions of hell.
I know.
Well, with that and being mindful of time,
A couple years from now, we'll go back and we'll get back on that track.
I'll shout this because I don't have anything, but I do want to say that the idea that I talked about that might come more in a less class-based society does still survive in our creed about the communion of saints.
Right.
It is still there.
Yeah, thank you, Susan, for that.
good point.
But every time we say sets of words obligatorily, without thinking, we are producing a system that's organizing how people should live and what should happen to those who aren't living that way. Okay, and
Yeah, and with that, I just want to add that this is actually a 2-part series.
Oh.
So hold on to these big thoughts that you're having, because next week Sid will be back and talking about she will be speaking of predestination.
Because you ask yourselves about this every day. Am I or am I not?
So
I don't know why I chose that.
So with that, please help me thank Sid for all of her hard work.
It's a good
and
one.
effort.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Oh, yes. Oh, I got this. I'm making noise with this. You're welcome. Had that in my underpants. Oh, thank you.
I won't be able to be here next week because of confirmation.
Oh,
so I wanted to
my.
be here this week.
Oh, my.
I mean, just that class.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. This is great. By the way, I heard that it's not just missable. The one time I saw the Aurora Borealis,
Yes.
there is a sound that
there
comes with it.
are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're trained to hear it.
Yeah.
In ways that we aren't necessarily quite so
Thunder,
trained.
only it wasn't thunder. It
Yeah.
was wild.
Yeah.
Anyway, this was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Started snowing over here.
Oh, it is. Tuesday, I'll see you Tuesday.
I miss you.
I have
my favorite.
talk to you soon. Oh, I know. Miss Di. Thank you.
Struck my imagination. You were into women's studies. I have been collecting over the last 10, 15 years or so books having to do with feminism and history and stuff. I've got about 6 cubic feet of these books. When I need to get rid of them, which is not now, but when it happens, does the university have a way that they could go to a student?
I don't think they take book, I mean,